Chapter 25. No Evil. Brad Wesley walked through his house, gun in hand. He'd be damned if he was going to wait for Dalton to come to him. He wasn't a man who hid from a fight. He'd already heard the shotgun blasts in his living room, so that's where he headed first. When he got there, he found the body of Ketchum first, face down on the floor with a hole blasted in its back. No matter. But nearby lay Pat, a knife sticking out of his chest. Wesley knew his sister wasn't going to be happy after all of this was done, and he had to explain that to her. Still, it was Dalton to blame, not him. A quick glance into the kitchen showed him O'Connor was down too. He figured the new one, Morgan, was just as likely incapacitated, or maybe he'd run off. Cowards. They were everywhere. Whoever had said, "You can't find the help," had the right of it. I don't need any of them, Wesley thought. He'd come to this town with nothing. And what he'd built around him here, he'd built with his own two hands. Once he'd dealt with this drifter, he could always find some new boys. Money and some balls could solve any problem. He'd just reinforce. That was all that was needed. And then there'd be hell to pay for anyone in Jasper who'd helped Dalton. They'd all lost their faith. 4 gunshots rang out from another part of the house. The echoed sounds told Wesley exactly where it was, and he headed in that direction, shaking his head. Those few shots told him that either Tinker had killed Dalton, or, more likely, that his last dog had just been put down. Not for the first time, he thought to himself, if you want something done well, you have to do it yourself. Dalton stayed in the room with all the wild beasts and the last downed henchman. If Wesley wanted to face him, he'd know where to find him now. His patience was quickly rewarded. "I see you found my trophy room, Dalton," came a call from the top of the stairs. Wesley was here. He flicked a switch and lights glowed on in the center of the room. "The only thing that's missing is your ass." Dalton adjusted his hiding position, much of the shadow now gone. He watched from behind a large bison as Wesley came down the stairs, gun in hand, still talking. "What's this all about, anyway?" he called out calmly. "Your friend Wade? One old man? That's what I call a mercy killing. I took him out of his misery. Now, you're not mad at me about that, are you?" Dalton contained the anger, the urge to rush out and take Wesley now. He had to be smart, be patient. "Hell, you took Jimmy," Wesley went on, walking across the center of the room. "And he was in better shape." He stopped beside the fallen polar bear and actually laughed at seeing his man trapped underneath, waving his arms out to his sides in an almost complimentary way. "Hell, you took all my boys." Dalton could just about see Wesley's face from where he was crouched, a visage half in light and half in shadow. The mirth left it, the grin dropping. Tired of this game of hide and seek. "Now come on out, Dalton," he offered. "This town is big enough for both of us. Let's talk about this." Dalton knew that the promise of a deal was false, that if he stepped out now, Wesley would let his bullets do the talking. He could see the man glancing around at the still dark corners of the big room, walking casually, but alert. looking for him and coming his way. When Wesley reached the bison, the largest animal in that part of the room and the only one big enough to hide a man, his casual demeanour became quickly more purposeful. He raised his pistol into a two-handed grip and thrust it around the side. Dalton wasn't there, having already moved around the back of the beast, and now came flying out from the other side. Dalton was fast, but this time Wesley was faster. He got off a shot before Dalton could reach him, and Dalton felt the bullet slam into his left shoulder. It was enough to slow his advance, but not enough to stop him totally, or to prevent the kick he had flicked out. His foot connected with the fingers of Wesley's hand, causing the firearm to go flying. Dalton regained his momentum and followed that up with two punches to Wesley's face and a side kick that sent his opponent tumbling into and over a small cream leather couch in the center of the room. Wesley quickly staggered back up to his feet and towards a large ceramic vase nearby. Sat under the heads of the wild beasts of the African plains, the vase contained several tribal spears. Wesley pulled one out. Grasping the wooden shaft and hefting it over his shoulder in a practiced motion, he sent the wickedly sharp spear point flying at Dalton. Dalton watched the flight carefully, seeing it almost in slow motion, and bobbed off to the side as he would against any strike aimed at his head. Wesley could see this approach wasn't going to work a second time, so when he pulled the next spear out, he adjusted his grip. The spearhead's sharp point angled down just below his hands, holding the solid shaft like a baseball bat. Dalton made his approach, the burning pain from his shoulder getting worse. He ducked Wesley's first two swings, but as he instinctively tried to parry the third, he found his left arm wouldn't move. The best he could do was curl his head down at the last minute and lean into the shot, taking it on his injured shoulder. The impact of the heavy stick sent a shot of pain like lightning up Dalton's arm and through his whole body, right down to his feet. It stopped him dead for a moment, and Wesley quickly followed up with another strike to the same spot. This one caused Dalton to topple into one of the nearby leather couches. Wesley was on him in a second, swinging the spear again, but missing. Then slamming its wickedly sharp tip towards Dalton. Dalton was just able to scramble away in time as the spear embedded into a wooden coffee table. The second it took Wesley to rock it free allowed Dalton to get back to his feet. He felt the blood running freely down his arm now, and he knew he was fading. This couldn't go on for much longer. His older opponent was tiring too. Wesley had been a man not to reckon with in a street fight during his youth in Chicago, but those days were long behind him. He panted as he held the spear up, now with the sharp end towards Dalton, like they were stood across from each other in some medieval battlefield. He thrust the point of the spear at Dalton's head. The attack came with good technique, but it was slow now that Wesley was tired. Dalton moved, more on fighter's instinct than by intention, to bob and weave the two high thrusts. When the low thrust, aimed to eviscerate his body, finally came in, he was ready. Dalton sidestepped and grabbed the shaft, broke it in half with one well-placed kick, and dragged the nearest, sharp-headed piece out of Wesley's sweat-slicked hands. He continued to follow the kick through into a spinning motion, coming around with the thick piece of wood in his hand and landing its length with a thud into the meat of Wesley's thigh. Dalton used the last of his strength to smash a knee into the other man's body and then topple him backward with two big punches to the face. Wesley fell into the armrest of the couch behind him. Dalton lunged forward on shaky legs to finally finish it, but Wesley still had his half of the spear shaft held tightly in his hand. He swung it down now in an overhead chop that caught Dalton flush on the side of the head. The younger man collapsed back to the floor. Wesley stood up over Dalton, exchanging his broken piece of the spear for the sharp one now lying on the floor. He raised it up high to bring it down into his incapacitated foe, but Dalton still had some energy left. His leg shot out and caught Wesley in the side of the knee. Wesley dropped the spear as his leg buckled, and he sat back down on the floor, unable to stand. For a few moments, both men lay panting, dripping blood, just a few feet away from each other, but unable to breathe or move. Dalton tried to stand and made it halfway there, grunting through the pain, his white shirt sleeve red with the blood from his shoulder wound. Wesley used the couch beside him to drag himself up to his feet. "I thought it would be fun to fight you, Dalton," he said, once his breath returned. "I really did. But now..." He reached down to the concealed ankle holster just over his right boot and pulled out the backup derringer he kept there. "I just don't have the time." Somewhere in the back of his mind, Dalton distantly heard Garrett's voice. On the first night they'd met, Dalton had tried to stop a few men fighting near the dance floor of a small club they were working together. Punches were already being thrown, but Dalton had stood between the men and tried to reason with them and talk them down. He'd got a bottle smashed across the side of his head for his efforts. Waiting at the ER for his first set of stitches, an ice pack held firmly against his bleeding head, he'd felt the strong hand of Wade Garrett grab his shoulder. The old cooler bent down to look him in the eye, like a father checking on his son after his first football game. "Rule number 1, kid," he had told him in his deep, gravelly voice. "Once the fighting has started, it's time to stop talking." Dalton came up to his feet with a left kick that sent the pistol flying from Wesley's grip mid-sentence. The follow-up right kick knocked his opponent back down onto the couch. Dalton was on him in a flash, using his knee and the full weight of his body to pin the stunned man down. Wesley looked up at him, knowing it was done. Dalton raised his right hand up into the air, the fingers curling again to form an iron claw. It was Wesley that was the claw's prey now, but floating in front of him, Dalton saw the face of the man in Memphis. The face of Jimmy by the river. He saw the face of the doc, the disappointment in her blue eyes. Hurt and regret fought with anger and hate as Dalton towered over his beaten foe. Wesley looked up, away from Dalton's conflicted face, captured instead by the hand, wavering there like a snake about to strike. Then the hand slowly dropped, and Wesley looked back up to see Dalton let go of the anger, his tensed shoulders finally releasing. Wesley breathed again for the first time in what felt like hours. The sound of footsteps came from the top of the stairs to the trophy room, and Dalton looked up to see the doc running down. In a distant corner of his mind, he wondered where she had come from and how she had got here. He gave Wesley one last look, a look that let him know that he had lost, yet lived by Dalton's mercy, and that there would still be consequences coming to him for everything he had done, to Dalton and to the rest of the town. Then he lifted his knee and his weight up off the man and turned to face the stairs, walking towards them to meet the doc at the bottom. "No!" she screamed out halfway down, and Dalton turned to see that Wesley had recovered his derringer. Wesley got to his feet, struggling to stand on his shattered knee, and pointed the gun at Dalton. "It's over!" he called out triumphantly, raising it up to fire. A loud gunshot rang out in the otherwise silent room. Tillman watched as Wesley stumbled back, the buckshot from Red's shotgun catching the bastard high in the right shoulder, knocking him backward. Dalton turned to see what had happened. Tillman watched the realization on his face as he saw Red standing there with Strudenmeyer beside him and Emmett not far away. It was Emmett who fired his shotgun next, this time slamming into Wesley's lower left gut. Strudenmeyer followed up with another blast, low and to Wesley's right side. Tillman watched as Wesley, somehow still standing despite being filled with lead, stumbled back and forth, his shirt a bloody, shredded mess. He still held the little pistol in his hand and was trying to raise it up again. Tillman stepped forward, an old side-by-side scattergun in his grip. "This is our town," he told Wesley, "and don't you forget it." He pulled the trigger, and the buckshot smashed right into the center of Wesley's chest. It took him off his feet, and he went flying backward and through a small glass coffee table behind him, his hands and feet hanging limply out over the wooden-framed sides. When it was done, nobody spoke for a minute. Then Tillman looked at Red and nodded. The other man nodded back, then quickly circled the room, collecting in all the old shotguns and heading out through a back door. Sirens could soon be heard outside, followed by the slamming of car doors. Then a shout of, "Brad, where are you?" came from a nearby room at the front of the house. "They're in here, Sheriff," came a reply soon after. When the local sheriff ran into the room, gun drawn and with two of his deputies in tow, he was met by a strange scene. Tillman watched him try to make sense of what he was seeing. The body of Wesley was a bloody mess in the wreckage at the center of the room. Some of Jasper's leading business owners were just stood there nearby, unharmed but unarmed, looking at all of this. And the local bouncer, Dalton, was stood next to them, with Red Webster's niece, the doctor, tending to his wounded arm, tears in her eyes. Off to one side, getting himself back up to his feet, was Wesley's own man, Tinker, a confused look on his face. "All right," said the sheriff, hesitantly holstering his gun now that there seemed to be no immediate threat. "Who's going to tell me what happened here?" After a moment, Emmett spoke up. "I didn't see nothing," he said simply. "You see anything, Pete?" "No, I didn't see anything," Strudenmeyer concurred. "You see anything, Red?" Red came walking back into the room, empty-handed. "I didn't see nothing. Not a thing." He shrugged. He looked over at Tinker, knowing that the fat man had seen it all go down while he was pulling himself out from under the stuffed body of the giant white bear. "You see anything, Tinker?" he asked. Tillman followed Tinker's bemused eyeline as he looked up to one of the taxidermy displays on the wall. 3 monkeys played on a branch, one covering its eyes, another its ears, and the last one its mouth. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Tinker looked back at the sheriff. "A polar bear fell on me," he said. Red and Strudenmeyer tried hard to contain their laughter in spite of the situation. Tillman looked back at the body of Wesley, the man who'd kept the people of this town down for far too long, and the man he'd just helped to kill. Then he looked over at Dalton, holding the doc in his arms. The two men's eyes met for a moment, and Tillman nodded his thanks. He knew that he'd made a few mistakes over the years, but this wasn't one of them.